Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. And listeners, I am bringing you an incredible conversation with the academician, the practitioner, Roger Martin, who is the author of When More Is Not Better. I also have to share something with you. This is take two. We got about 5 minutes in, and I realized that I forgot to press record. So we're starting over, but I am sure that we are going to have an even better first 5 minutes than we did the last time. So let me tell you a little bit about Roger Martin. He is widely hailed as one of the people who may help us save democratic capitalism. He is hailed as someone who could help us reverse the trajectory that we are currently on, where the middle class is shrinking and the rich are getting richer, and a lot of the people in the middle class are slipping into poverty. And that's where his book, When More Is Not Better, comes in. But before I share with you a little bit more about that book and introduce him to you and bring him on the podcast, let me say just a bit more about him. If I was to read his full bio, well, it would take 30 minutes. Literally, that practically the entire podcast would be done. But let me just start by telling you that he is an accomplished academician and thought leader. I first encountered him actually through HBR, which is Harvard Business Review. I think you all know I'm a subscriber, and I really like to nerd out on it. That's where I first encountered him, and then found his book, and then realized that he has run nonprofits. He has served on the board of a nonprofit. And again, he is an academician. He spends a lot of his time thinking about ways that organizations, and that includes both nonprofits and for-profits, can be more effective. Now, you might notice that I did not say more efficient. And that's because, and he and I are going to talk about this, as a economic society, whether we're talking about the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, or the governmental sector, we have become obsessed with efficiency. And I believe by the end of today's episode, you're going to be on the bandwagon that we should be thinking about effectiveness more than we should be thinking about efficiency. And so with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Roger Martin to the podcast. Hey, Roger, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be on with you. Thank you for having me.
So, right after I introduced you, we had such a great little conversation, and then we danced over to the first question, and we're just going to dance right over to the first question this time. So you talk about the fact that sometimes efficiency is bad. And the first time I read that, I had a little quizzical moment in my brain. So talk to me and our listeners about this.
Sure. And most people will have that quizzical moment because kind of the notion that is instilled in us is, well, just more efficiency is always better. And I would say that more efficiency is better for a long time, right? If you've got a terribly, terribly inefficient system, you can make advances by pushing the efficiency. But what we've done in our economy and our businesses in it has become so obsessed that we've pushed it past the point of optimality. And in particular, what we've done is used proxies to measure efficiency that end up being problematic. So we'll say, well, it's more efficient to have lower labor costs. Right. If we have this many people on the shop floor at a given time, we wouldn't want to have more than one labor hour more on the shop floor. So let's tamp that down so that we got 0 extra hours on the floor. Now that may feel efficient because we've gotten rid of all slack, all waste, but if there's a customer on the store floor who needs a little extra time and it's not in your algorithm for how many person hours of clerks do you need and checkout people do you need per customer, then suddenly you get bad service and that customer may buy less, may not come back. And so even though you're on your proxy for efficiency, kind of labor hours per guest, that looks good, the actual result is not so good. It's less traffic, fewer purchases, less happy customers, etc. And that's what happens when you take a proxy for efficiency and say, we're going to hammer that to the absolute extreme. And that, unfortunately, Dolph, is what's happening writ large in the economy. This obsession that says, let's figure out a metric for efficiency, and then let's absolutely push that as far as humanly possible.
Before we hone in on how this impacts the nonprofit sector, I'd also love for you to share with our listeners why this obsession with efficiency is creating a more bifurcated society economically, one where the rich get richer and the middle class is shrinking.
Yeah, well, what it's done is kind of suppressed the wage levels of that average, that median family in America. And so what we're getting it's a very much a talent-based economy now, where if you're special and unique, and they say, I don't want somebody like Dolph, I want Dolph. If that happens, then you're okay. But if you're not, if you say you want somebody to fulfill this function, what's happening is those wage levels and benefits and everything are just being ground down in an attempt to be ever more efficient. How can we be more efficient? Let's grind those down. And so what's happened is the economic growth is going to the people at the tail of the distribution, the upper tail of the distribution, who have that kind of special talent that enables them to essentially negotiate for themselves a bigger piece of the pie. So that's why we're having pretty decent economic growth. I mean, it would always be nice to be higher, but the economic growth in the economy hasn't been so bad over the last 40 years. But the median income growth has been dreadful, just dreadful. And I think a real culprit is this push for efficiency that is putting the damper on middle class wages.
So it's not just, as you were initially describing, okay, let's maximize efficiency and have the fewest number of work hours possible. It's also, let's maximize efficiency and pay as little as possible.
Yes, that's become a proxy, right? We're efficient. We're efficient if we can cut labor costs. We're efficient if we can cut procurement costs, even if that means putting our suppliers out of business or putting our suppliers in a position where they can't actually invest to give us better things and better products, better inputs for our services. So it's all just the notion has become, if I can show on a given proxy, procurement costs, labor hours, labor costs, whatever, if I can show improvement there, we must be doing better. No, not necessarily.
It's interesting you say that. And I recently was working on a blog post on wages in the nonprofit sector. And I just did a quick Google search and, looked up some case manager positions within a few miles of my home. And not surprisingly, and those that listed, most did not list compensation, but those that listed compensation, and these are case managers working with vulnerable populations, often impoverished people. Almost every single person who accepts that job, if they have even one dependent, would qualify for food stamps.
Yeah. That's what we've gotten to, which it's the zero sum game approach rather than the positive sum game approach. Like what I like, and I talk about in the book, is Costco, right? When you think about Costco, right, you think, hey, they're a club store. They have to be really sharp on prices, or nobody's going to go there. And so you'd say, and the way to do that is to grind down your labor costs, not have much labor, minimum staffing in the stores, kind of low retail wages. And they don't, right? Their lowest wages are in excess of $20 an hour. That's like the absolute bottom at Costco, and they figure out what number of labor hours they need in the store to serve customers, and then just add a big slush factor. It's not exactly clear what it is, but it's like 10-15%. Just have that many more people, and you'd say, that's insane. In a club store, you have to, where you're in a competition, but they do better than everybody else. Why? It's because people love them. People love Costco. And why do they love Costco? It's because when they're in Costco, they're treated with respect by employees who love Costco, love their job, know their job well, don't have one single job, are often cross-trained to do a bunch of jobs, so it's a more enjoyable job. And they're in an organization that promotes almost entirely from within. If you want to be CEO of Costco sometime you better start on the store floor. You're not going to get there. They don't parachute in MBAs to fill in the top spots. So that's a sort of a positive sum game. It's sort of like, why don't we just pay everybody a whole lot and make their jobs better, and people will come, and they're, in their category, they're the runaway leader on all the metrics: sales per square foot, profitability, all of that. So you can sort of take this zero-sum game approach, right, where you think it's sort of a machine, as I talk about in the book. It's a machine where, if we just take a few labor hours out, the machine will produce more. I would argue that Costco says, no. It's a complicated system. It's a complex system. And you gotta think about the system as a whole. And that includes thinking about the lives of your employees and thinking about the effect that your employees feeling good about themselves, their life, their economic situation will impact positively on the customers.
It's interesting you say that, and I was not aware of that about Costco until I started to follow you a little bit. But I'll share with you, we became Costco loyalistas during the pandemic because we live in a state that maybe is we live in a state that's did not take the pandemic nearly as seriously as other states, and so there was not a mask mandate, et cetera. And we were so impressed at the steps that Costco was taking to protect not just the people walking in, but also the employees that were walking in. And every employee was taking it seriously. Like, we'd been to other stores where masks were mandated, but employees would wear the mask around their chin. And Costco was taking it so seriously. I did not fully understand how they had such a strong esprit de corps, or corporate discipline, if you will. And now I better understand it. It's because they treat their employees well, they pay well, and they've not stressed their employees out by stretching them thin. No.
They just the opposite. And again, this is not my discovery. This is a wonderful woman named Zeynep Ton, who's an MIT professor who wrote a book called The Good Jobs Strategy. And I'm now chair of the Good Jobs Institute that's trying to instill this in companies across the country. It's such a different model, and it's so doable. Right. And it's, to me, so sad that the dominant model in business is this efficiency-driven model. And then it's supported by all these other parts of the system. The capital markets care about your quarterly earnings and so you're encouraged to sacrifice the future to get your quarterly earnings up. All of those systems, there's no great evil person in behind all of this, designing these things to produce bad results, but they just happen to combine to do that. And that's what we want to reverse.
And I think that happens in the nonprofit sector too. And I think it does not happen around quarterly earnings, but it does happen when you start to talk to funders, especially large foundation funders, who will say, well, you've had deficits for the last 2 years, and until you fix that, we are not going to be able to invest, i.e. give you a grant.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen that world. As you may know, I was on the board of the Skoll Foundation for 14 years. And so we were a foundation making grants. And yes, you have to be really careful about the incentive structure that you set up with your grants, because you can cause the grantees to do things to keep costs down in ways that actually aren't good for the customer base that they're trying to serve, whatever underprivileged customer base they're trying to serve. And so you have to actually think as a foundation about how will the grantee who I'm giving money to be best positioned to serve the people it's attempting to serve. You can't just think about the one stage. How are we going to make sure our money is being well spent? No, that's not enough. You've got to think all the way through that chain, I believe.
About 10 years ago, I ended up having a serious conversation, which went nowhere, but had a serious conversation with a large community foundation in one of the mid-Atlantic states. And the reason is they actually had a rule that said if you had a deficit in the prior year, you were not eligible for a grant in the current year. And I pointed out to them that they had a number of organizations that were no longer eligible for funding after they implemented that rule because they own large facilities but have small budgets. And of course, they were having to depreciate the non-cash depreciation, the facility. And so as an example, in one case, the organization had about a $700,000 a year budget, but was depreciating non-cash $200,000 a year. And so literally, I was saying to the foundation, you would require that they have a $200,000 cash surplus. What organization in the nonprofit sector is going to operate with that? And, pretty much they said, well, we studied this diligently and we'll review it again in 3 years, but this is what our policies are going to be.
Yeah. No, it's this great schism that I think people need to understand better between your model, what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm sure what they're trying to accomplish is we would like to make sure these nonprofits are being financially responsible and not getting themselves into deficits and then needing a bailout and et cetera. So I think we could all probably agree with that goal, but then it gets implemented through a proxy. Right? A rule, in this case, if you have a prior year deficit, no. And what happens is that people start to think the rule is the model, right? So they think the rule of I won't fund people who had a deficit is what's going to make sure that we have kind of fiscal responsibility. It's not, right? The map is not the territory. The proxy is not the model. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have proxies, but if you have only one like that, it's much more dangerous. It's much more easy. It's easier for you to fall prey to thinking that the map is the territory when you've only got that one, and that's why shareholder value maximization is just a terrible one. So many sins are committed in the pursuit of shareholder value maximization. And I would say it's a little bit, Aristotle had wise words on this. Aristotle said way back when, if a person sets out in life to be happy, the person is not likely to end up happy. But if the person sets out to live a good life, by which he meant a life of servitude to your fellow citizens, your community, you're likely to end up happy. So he was a system dynamics guy, right? Saying sometimes when you try to do something explicitly, you're not going to accomplish it. And I often think that's the sad thing about lots of these rules of the sort you've said. You think the rule is going to get you more of what you want, and the rule ends up getting you less of what you want.
Mm-hmm. Which almost seems to tie in Aristotle's concept there, almost all seems to tie into a concept that you talk about, which is not pursuing a singular goal.
Yeah, I think singular goals just are kind of dangerous in a complex adaptive system, right? They don't work in a simple machine-like system, right? Push the gas pedal and the car will speed up. That's okay to have goals in those simple systems, but we're talking about complex ones. And I use the example of Southwest Airlines, right? The most successful airline in the US over the last half century now that it's been in operation. And there might be some people on the right surface of it would say, I don't like that Southwest. They're a low cost carrier. I bet they really are cheap on everything and they beat up on their employees to get their costs down and the like. And the answer is exactly the opposite, because Southwest Airlines has goals of being the lowest cost, highest customer satisfaction, highest employee satisfaction, and most profitable airline. And you'd say, wait a minute. How do you get to be low cost and highest employee satisfaction? The answer isn't terrifically complicated in one sense. It's they pay their employees more than any of the other airlines. So the low cost air carrier has got higher wage levels, and everybody says, they're non-union. Nope, they're as unionized as every other airline. They're not a non-union carrier. So you say, whoa, how do you pull that off? And the answer is by being more clever. It forces you to be more clever. And they say, you know what? We're going to pay more per labor hour, but we're going to have fewer labor hours per passenger seat mile by organizing the business system to waste fewer labor hours. So we're going to have one kind of jet, so we don't have to keep moving around the gates and we can customize our equipment for putting stuff in the hold of a 737. All sorts of things. I could go on and on, but they've done all sorts of things that make them able to fly for less labor hours per passenger seat mile. So their costs are lower per passenger seat mile, which is what matters. Then you can charge lower prices. And they've got happy employees who are cross-trained, will do multiple jobs. And in the labor negotiations, what they say in the labor negotiations is salary, it's almost like you tell us, right? But on these other things, we need all sorts of flexibility. So you'll do many jobs because you'll be happier and we'll be more efficient. So their labor negotiations are completely different than the labor negotiations of the others. And I think it stems from having this notion of we are not pursuing one thing. We're pursuing a whole lot of things that look insanely difficult together, but that's our job. That's our job, to figure it out.
So how do we take this Southwest model, this Costco model, and apply it to our Main Street nonprofits? Maybe those that have a $250,000 budget or a $5 million budget.
Sure. Well, I think it's what I would say to any one of them is think about having more than one goal and think about having ones that are at least mildly contradictory, because that will force you to do what you're doing more cleverly, and it will not let you slip into the notion that our model is this proxy. So let's just say, I don't know, you're a nonprofit kind of working on recidivism, and if you say and our goal is to get recidivism percentage kind of down as far as possible, I think that's a good idea. But if that's your only goal, then you'll think of your model as minimal recidivism. Whereas you might want to have the goal being, I want to have lower recidivism, and I want to have the quality of life of the ex-prisoner to have these kind of qualities. You're not just working on one thing. You're understanding that it is complex. Now, it turns out, I think both will help one another, but they're different goals, so that you can lay out those and then not be focused obsessively on recidivism. And what I would say for nonprofits, now, then this may be controversial, but it comes from my experience. I was for 10 years on the board of trustees of the finest children's hospital in Canada, and one of the finest in the world. It's called the Hospital for Sick Children. It's generally ranked in the top 3 in the world. And the comp committee put in an incentive compensation plan for the CEO, a wonderful woman named Mary Jo Haddad, who'd risen shockingly up from being a nurse to the CEO. And I say shockingly because it's really tough. There is real bias by the docs against nurses rising that high. It's great woman. Loved her as a CEO. And the Ontario government was asking the hospitals to put more incentive-based compensation into CEO comp. And so the comp committee comes to the board with this plan that she's going to get this kind of bonus if she gets infant mortality down here and morbidity and and all of these things. She'd get these bonuses. And I turned to Mary Jo in the board meeting and said, "Listen, I know you're very diplomatic and everything, and you want to go along with what a compensation committee says in the Ontario government, but seriously, Mary Jo, are you going to work harder and more diligently to have more babies come out of this hospital alive because you're going to get an extra, I don't know, $50,000 or $75,000 bonus? Really?" And she sort of smiled and said, very diplomatically, "Well, I understand why we have to do these things, but Roger, I became a nurse, whatever it was, 28 years ago, because I wanted to save babies. And I've been saving babies my entire career. I wake up in the morning trying to save baby. I go to night thinking about how I can save babies the next day. So no, and this is not going to have any impact. And I said, and wouldn't you say it's a bit insulting? And she said, I know no insult was intended, but yeah, it kind of is, right? The notion that I would try harder to save babies because I've got a bonus coming if I do. And so I would say in nonprofits, don't do that, right? You got to recognize why people are in nonprofits, right? They're not in nonprofits to earn incentive compensation, right? They're in nonprofits to make the world a better place in some way, in whatever way they're thinking about. So don't have a model of human beings that is inconsistent with those human beings.
So Roger, I have to share with you, I made that mistake as an executive director once, and I got to share with you how I made it. And gosh, was it a big mess up. So I was running a housing organization.
Yes.
And we came up with, the board and some other really smart folks. We came up with this great idea that we were going to start to evaluate our housing case managers based on the time from program admission to transition into permanent housing. And we were going to tie that performance evaluation to compensation. And there were some unintended consequences we had not thought through. And so when, we ran it as a pilot, which is probably a good thing to do, see how this is going to work. So we ran it as a pilot. And here's what the initial numbers showed. There was this flurry of activity in the final month before an evaluation when clients would be transitioned into more permanent, more stable housing. And when we evaluated 3 months later, a higher percentage of clients failed to maintain their stable housing as opposed to the old model. And the reason is, now that we're evaluated on it, wasn't it Drucker that said, what's measured is what people are going to act on? And so now that people knew they were being evaluated on it, people are like, oh, I want to look good for this evaluation. I didn't even think it was about the compensation. They just wanted to look good for the evaluation. So they said, I need to get my numbers up. Who do I think I could possibly get into more permanent housing now? Whether or not they were ready. And so I had to go back to staff and say, gosh, this was a knuckleheaded idea and we're going to rethink it. And this is not how we're going to do it.
That's Dolph, it's a great story. And I think, in some sense, everybody's got to learn that kind of lesson, because this is not simple, and you have these great intentions. But I think one of the great misses in the world of compensation is the degree to which compensation works too well in some sense, right? It in that case, it worked too well. It got people to do things that actually weren't in your interests, and that happens kind of over and over and over again. But here's an interesting thing: there has not yet been a rigorous study done which demonstrates that incentive compensation is correlated with organizational performance.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You can correlate it to a certain extent, although the correlations are less strong than you would think, with individual performance. But is an organization just a sum of individuals, or is it an organization that works like an organization? The answer is it works like an organization. And so when you try and give each individual an incentive compensation, there's enough cross roughs between those that essentially it dampens the effect. So think of the millions and millions of person hours a year that are spent designing incentive compensation systems, and then measuring people against those then having the conversations about what incentive compensation you earned. None of it is correlated with performance of the organization.
Wow. So really what I think I hear you saying is take the time to hire right and pay fairly, and maybe even pay quote unquote more than fairly. So if going wage is not a livable wage, maybe pay even more than fairly. and then really focus on making sure people are doing their jobs well.
Yeah, it's having a. I think everything you said is right. Hire carefully, but then also the thing I'd say is just create a culture that reinforces the things that you want to accomplish. Right. So the culture at Costco is of, they're our customers. We must serve them well. We must help them find what they want to find. Give them the advice they're seeking. They're our lifeblood, And so you have a culture where people can feel a sense of pride for doing that. I wrote an article once called "The Power of Happiness," and I made the following argument: people are happy. There's a holy trinity of happiness. People are happy to the extent that, one, they're a valued member of a community, two, that they value, and three, is valued by people outside the community. That makes a person really happy. So if you are a valued member of a Costco kind of, let's say, the butcher department, you're a valued member of that department. And instead of thinking, yeah, but the rest of them all suck and our department is terrible, but thinking, hey, and I value that. We're good. We're good at what we do. So the fact that they say, hey, Dolph, you're a good butcher. You serve the customers well. You'd be happy. And then if every once in a while the general manager, points out to everybody in the store what a great job the butcher department has done, then you say, I'm really happy, right? Because you're a valued member of a community that you value and is valued by people outside. Or if the Fortune magazine and the Wall Street Journal writes stories about how great Costco is, that makes you happy. And so I think that level of happiness is way more important than incentive compensation. Now, you said something really critical early on: fair. If your compensation is unfairly low, none of these things will work. But if your compensation is considered fair, right? Fair for the task you're doing. And I would say the Costco employees don't think their compensation is excessive. I think they think it's fair because they go over and above what their buddies over at BJ's or Sam's Club or whatever their competitors do. So if you've got fair compensation, then the way you're going to get great work is by focusing on the trinity of happiness and making sure you have a culture that says to you, Dolph, what you're doing as a butcher, awesome. Your customers love you. Your fellow workers love working with you, awesome. That is going to be more valuable to you as a human being than saying, because of that, we're going to give you, a $10 performance bonus or $100 or $1,000. Even that is not what makes you happy, and that's, I think, why incentive compensation is so silly.
Roger, I love that. And part of what I love about it is not only have you shared with listeners why sometimes efficiency is a bad thing, you've also shared the secret to happiness. And, that's something we all kind of want to know. So I love that.
And I think it's important for nonprofits, for what it's worth, Dolph. So I think, though, nonprofits have to be careful. Nonprofits should have that happiness advantage, right? But I think a bunch of them squander it by being bureaucratic. Right. And I think you've got to recognize that you're doing a good thing as a nonprofit, but then make sure people feel that sense that I'm a valuable member of the community that is delivering this. And one of my rules is, while in theory, I could imagine a situation where an organization celebrates too much. Theoretically, you could spend all day long celebrating and not getting anything done. So theoretically, that's possible. Empirically, I've never seen an organization that celebrated too much. I've seen thousands that have celebrated too little. You should feel like you should celebrate every week, right? To just celebrate. Hey, that was a great thing we did this week, Dolph. just saying, you went out of your way to help that the housing thing, get housing, and I just want to give you a pat on the back that that's what we do when we're at our best. That's celebration, and it makes a world of difference because it gets the Trinity going.
That is such a great place for us to lay it down, is just for us as nonprofits to remember we've got to be celebrating as an organization and the people we work with. We've got to be celebrating. Now, I want to make sure I've asked you the off-the-map question. And Roger, that's a question we ask every guest. It's a different one for each guest. It just helps us get to know the guest a little bit more as a person. And sometimes the off-the-map question's not that far off the map. And in this case, it turns out it's not. So you talked about the secret of happiness, and you've talked about the importance of celebration. So here's my question for you. You have had an accomplished and storied career. But I'm curious to know, over the course of not just your career, but even pre-career, maybe when you were a teenager, over the course of your life, what has been your favorite job, the job that brought you the most happiness, and why?
It probably was a unpaid nonprofit job. And that was, I went on the board of Tennis Canada, and in 2005, Canada was just terrible in tennis, hadn't had a great player in forever. And we, a little cabal of us on the board, made a choice to compete to be what we said was a leading tennis nation. And we managed to transform Canadian tennis so that everybody's like baffled at how is it that we have so many great young tennis players. We've got the two best young male tennis players in the world. We've got top 10, top 20 tennis players like we've never had before, and so it's just fun to take on something where basically everybody said you just can't do that. It's not doable. It's a cold country where with no tennis courts, no tennis history, no tennis anything. And now people from around the world are studying Canada to say, how the heck can a non-tennis country, a hockey country, do this well? So that was fun, in part because it was pro bono. I like doing things like that. I'm, I guess, nationalist enough to say I like to see Canada doing that. And it's now, I've had the desire to show Canadians that the number one reason that Canada doesn't succeed in things is it doesn't believe it can. And in this case, we said we can succeed at the highest level. We have nothing going for us to do that, but we can do it anyway just by saying we're going to, and then being able to put together a strategy and then sticking to that strategy for doing it. So that's probably the funnest thing I did.
I love the fact that it was a unpaid board job that brought you the most happiness. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Dolph. I have such a contrasting experience. I've absolutely loved my nonprofit boards: Tennis Canada, Hospital for Sick Children, School Foundation. There's a bunch of others, but those would be ones that people would know. I've really, really, really disliked my time on corporate boards. So I don't go on corporate boards, and I'm always on nonprofit boards. Like I'm the chair of the Good Jobs Institute now, which I'm loving. And that's one of the interesting things I think about nonprofits. And for all your listeners, not in the for-profit world, board members are substitutes for management. Right? They both have the same training and they think of themselves as substitutes. So management doesn't like to listen to the board. In nonprofits, it's much more often a situation of compliments, right? So the docs and the chiefs and the surgeons and everything at Sick Kids were happy to hear me talk about, well, this would be a way of thinking about that. And they'd like, oh, that's that's interesting. I didn't tell them how to do surgery, so I respected them, but there's more of that. So it's one piece of advice I'd give to nonprofits is you can get a lot out of your board because they're complementary, and treat them as complementary, utilize their complementarity, and you can get a heck of a lot out of it in ways that for-profit boards, I think management doesn't get as much out of them. So hopefully that's a little helpful tidbit for all of your nonprofit executives out there.
That's incredibly helpful, Roger. Thank you. And listeners, if you want to learn more about Roger, and there's so many reasons you should be following this person. Really, there are. First of all, go to rogerlmartin.com. There you can see his blog, you can see links to his writings, and the guy's prolific, like really, and not only prolific, but some of the highest quality in terms of management counsel and advice that I read comes from him. And also, do not forget to make sure you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your bookstore of choice and get his book, When More Is Not Better. I believe that book should be a must-read for all of us in the nonprofit sector. Hey, Roger, thank you so much for joining us today.
Dolph, it was a blast. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And listeners, don't forget, you can get the link to Roger's website, the link to buy his book, and more at our show notes at successfulnonprofits.com. And if you like today's episode, there is one in particular I really want you to listen to, and it's Lead True with Dr. Jeff Thompson. And the reason is I kind of feel like Dr. Thompson epitomizes what we talked about today. And in that conversation, he talks about helping his hospital take the radical step of taking about a quarter of their endowment, and instead of investing it in the market, where in index funds where they felt like they had kind of a guaranteed ability to generate income and generate investment growth, they made the decision to take a quarter of their endowment and invest it in small businesses in the low-income community around the hospital. And I think it's the perfect example of sometimes more is not better. Sometimes you can meet your mission just a little bit better when you do something that's outside the box. That, listeners, is our show for the week. I hope you have gained some insight to help your nonprofit thrive in a competitive environment. And please, don't forget, I'm not an accountant nor an attorney, and neither I nor the Goldenberg Group provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for tax, legal, and accounting advice. I say this at the end of every episode, so it should not come as a surprise. If you find yourself in need of this type of counsel or advice, please find a credentialed, qualified professional who can assist you. And if you don't know of someone, reach out to me. I might know someone in your area.